Okay, so today I'm going to do another episode of my Absolutist philosophy series, and so this one is going to be about the human ego and how it's used to trick and control you. And of course I have the misfortune of, really with these sessions, something's always wrong. So now this one, it just started raining. It wasn't raining like until 10 minutes ago, right till I'm about to do this, right? But it starts raining heavy, so that might affect the sound quality or whatever, which isn't that good to begin with. But it's a situation where let's explore the human ego. There's a few things that are used to bypass your rational side and sort of, we get into this trick and trap of defining humanity incorrectly, right? And so this is used to control us. So we say, let's look at it objectively. Human beings are animals, and that might be taken with a negative connotation, but it's not. Human beings are animals. That's an objective scientific fact. There's nothing wrong with that. But we want to reject some of the tendencies associated with animals and act like we're something more. But the reality is that we are animals, and then we can still counteract some of those things. But what that tells you is the fact that what separates human beings from animals. This is one of my core kind of tenets of absolutist philosophy from way back, is basically just define, first of all, what makes a human being, right? What makes us different than animals? I won't even say better, but just different. The only real meaningful difference is we have the self-awareness, greater self-awareness and intelligence, right? That's the only difference. That's why we're able to build our technology. That's why we're able to do everything that we do, right? Even building communities and things like that. So, not saying animals don't do that to some degree, but that's really the defining factor. So it's our ability to think, it's our mind, it's self-awareness, it's intelligence, all of those things, right? Capacity for those things is what defines us as humans. So it's not emotion, right? Which is nothing more than the irrational insistence upon the self. It's not, heart, like even it's a misnomer in a literal sense, right? It's not any of that. Right? Animals have hearts too, literal physical hearts. But what it means is there's this weird token egoism that goes into it. Like, well, we value something just for the sake of it, and it's hard to explain this actually. Like, it'll be a subversive state that is argued for, that is used to justify some lesser state and say, well, we're doing it in the name of a mass number of people or a collective or something like this, right? So it's okay to live a lesser state. Part of the fallacy built into that is the amalgam theory and village of 100 concept that I talk about, where basically what you're doing is, well, you're overextending it. So you say, oh, we overextend all these parts of society and sacrifice for the collective. And this, so what would be the solution to that then? Right, let's stop having so many kids. And, again, if the world is a village of 100, now you wouldn't need to overextend. So it's a false conflict that you're creating yourself, right? A lot of things are only necessary because of the mass number of people. You could argue, well, they're only possible because of that too, but that's kind of ex post facto justification, right? You wouldn't need so many things or so many, whether it be technology or other things that are used to kind of quell the masses, like, oh, running water. Well, it's quite possible humanity would be just fine without running water like we were in earlier times and this and that. A convenience, even something as basic as that, but a convenience, but it's like, oh, there's plenty of water for people to live on. It's like, oh, it's only because of the number of people that we, electricity, because there's so many people, we need these things in overextension. But there is sort of a basic fallacy because you're self-creating that circumstance, again, by what I call the stimuli acme preservation, that you vouch for the state if you do that. So that's like a basic absolutist concept here. You don't choose to be born. You don't choose what society, what time period, anything like that, right? So you don't choose that. That's true of anybody. But what you can choose is don't perpetuate the state. don't preserve the state that you didn't choose through the stimuli acme, meaning having children, unless you vouch for it. So if you have children, you have zero credibility, because it's one of two things. Either you're in a utopian perfect state that you vouch for, in which case you can't complain about anything, especially not the kids themselves. Oh, I'm struggling to put food on the table for the kids. You can't do that. You chose to have them. You vouch for the state. So you have zero credibility because you're in a perfect utopian state. So there should be nothing from you. Everything should be perfect because you're vouching for the state. If it's not perfect, then you have no credibility either, because then why would you preserve the state that you didn't vouch for? That's the one piece of control that you can always have. That's the clutch of the wrist technique that I won't explain right now because it's a little graphic, but it's the idea. That's your life in your hands. So what would many absolutists do? They could end society so easily without needing to do anything violent or extreme, or they would put it to the test. Like, it must reach a certain state that they vouch for, regardless what standard, what measure. That's up to them. That's up to you. But if they don't vouch for the state, they're not going to preserve it. They're not going to have children. And that's all it would take to end or put pressure on a society. Like, it's just that simple. You don't have to preserve the state. You don't have to vouch for the state. You don't have to do anything extreme. You just don't have to have kids. You don't have to do it. So you're putting your life in your hands. Like, the problem being that you didn't get to choose your own, but you can certainly choose whether you perpetuate it and continue that non-choice reaction on. So, and again, the vouching for the state part is important because you say, what would it take for you to vouch for the state? And a lot of people only distract or overcompensate for it. They don't really address it. But the conflict of contrivance being, whatever it might be, is that you have some qualms, you have some inhibitions, you have some, existential uncertainty and this and that. So it's very irresponsible and selfish to preserve the stimuli acme by doing that, because again, you neither understand it, nor address it, nor vouch for it, nor do you have a measure defined, nothing. You're just a hedonistic animal who just can't control themselves, right? You're not doing it from a place of self-actualization, like, okay, I vouch for the state, therefore I preserve it with this plan, this. No. It's just as random and arbitrary as how you came to be, right, that you're also doing that. So you perpetuate the process, you have zero credibility, none, because it should be a utopian state that you vouch for, nothing to complain about, it should be perfect. Or if you don't, then that's also no credibility, because you see, it's a difference of standard. That's the thing. People might interject something here, but the only difference between an absolutist and everybody else would be, they actually have standards. They actually have high standards, or any standard at all that they define. They have a measure that they can define for themselves. This is how how they value something. Whereas ordinary people are just mindless sheep who go along with anything, or they even don't even know what they want. So it's this weird, like, victimization mentality. Like, let's be a little edgy here, I guess. I'm a stimuli acme preserver, and I'm gonna exploit my appearance for favors and money as I'm growing up at a certain age, whatever. And then I'm going to have kids and then complain about it. Oh, look, woe is me, struggle here. How about you don't preserve the stimuli acme? How about you don't appeal to that, right? And then decide what you're going to do. But that's why the stimuli acme is so pervasive that you can't, it's not that you can't escape it, it's just too tempting. It's just too easy. It's just too basic, right? This is the animal side, something below animals, because if even animals don't obsess over it that much. Animals would just do the deed and be done with it, but no, we have to obsess over it and base our whole life around it. But getting back to the ego basis alone, you understand that the ego is used to control you the same way that emotion is, the same way that emotion, ego, even like gratification, even there's something else I would say too. Just things that basically bypass your critical thinking. So emotion is not productive. It's just irrational insistence upon the self. Like something doesn't go your way, so you get mad about it. Even to best achieve that same end of your own self-interest, it would not be productive to be emotional. You could argue it can be a motivating factor, but if you're already sure and decided what your intention or measure or motivation is, you shouldn't need that. It should be, well, okay, let's think about how to best achieve this. It's more like a cry in powerlessness once you're reduced to a subversive state that you didn't choose, that you still accept and defer to anyway, which also kills your credibility. Now you say, okay, you're going to be emotional because it's the only outlet you have in a subversive state, assuming that that's the subversive state you ought to be in, where that shows you that that's the real problem, where there's always an overcompensation for some flawed process. So you don't question the process, you just seek the overcompensation. But the other thing you have to understand is, again, human beings are not defined by heart or soul, or heart, which is just a body part that even animals have, the soul, which doesn't exist, all these other kind of strange things that we try to defer to. None of that is real. What is real is the mind. What is real is our self-awareness. What is real is our intelligence, right? Why can't we face reality? It's because we might not accept then certain unqualified empirical structure, but I would still, again, objectively prefer to see the objective truth rather than deny it, because it shouldn't be necessary to do that. So again, once you realize that, okay, now let's see how the ego is used to control you. The ego is used to control you in the following way: that you seek, it turns everything into gratification, like, you're proving something. So you do this, right? Let me see. You would basically, in society, right? This is where absolutists would reject the ego, and it's meaningless, because true value would be inherent. There wouldn't be any need for this. So you through the ego, you get value from externality. You rely on value from someone or something else. So, you need the validation of other people, your family, your friends, your spouse, your lover, your society as a whole. You seek that validation, right? Even though it's arbitrary, subjective, collective, not necessarily based on a standard. Because think about it. If you had a standard yourself, that would be self-fulfilling. So it's like, okay, you're going to do something, and that would speak for itself, if it's valuable or not. You don't need that. So it kind of muddies the water. Either it's redundant, in which case they're cheering on something that is productive, but it's productive anyway, or by whichever standard, or if it's not, then they could overcompensate and misguide it. Like, people could cheer on something that isn't necessarily credible, or they could boo down something that is credible. So it's arbitrary, it's subjective. So why would you rely on that? Or even externality takes on a different form, like why people need drugs or substances. The human imagination and mind is quite powerful, that it can do a lot of the things that you would want to do on drugs, or whatever, substances. Anyway, you could do it on your own. You could just act silly and goofy, or let loose, or be in a different state of mind, and meditation, and all these different things. So the fact that you would assume or require or desire external substances for that shows you that you're not really free in your mind, because the fact that you're relying on that shows you something. That I had like a very specific analogy with this. Like, you can be free in the mind, or you can always rely on something like, in order to feel this way, I need to use this substance, right, in order to be open-minded or free. Or why couldn't you just be that way anyway? Anyone can, the mind is very free, very objective, very open, right? So you've been so reduced to an indoctrinated state that now you seek something from externality, that like, you need this thing to feel this way or to be a certain way, even though you could be that way anytime or all the time, potentially, because, again, the mind is very open and free that way, that you wouldn't need to limit it. So there'd be... But again, okay, let's get back to the ego thing. I keep getting off track. Basically, it's used to control you in a few different ways, right? So there's ego association, which means you didn't choose to be born, right? You didn't choose your family, your country, your upbringing, where you live, etc. So you create this fallacy with the non-basis of self. In other words, value is nothing more than that which is, there is no basis for value, right, in a standard or some kind of accountable criteria. It's rather just yourself, and anything that is nearest to you is valued for that reason alone. So, for example, family is a good example. You don't have any criteria to it. You didn't choose them, but now you'll value them at a high level, supposedly, because they happen to be, you happen to be around them, happen to be exposed to them, right? And the same thing again, you'll value your country because you happen to be born there, happen to live there, or you'll value people around you, like, oh, my best friend who happened to be in the same geographical area as me, or my soulmate, the same. So you're not using actual standard or criteria, you're just insisting upon things that you didn't choose and acting like you did, or that you value them, or that they're absolute, even though it's arbitrary, because by the same process you could switch out any of those elements. If you happen to be born in a different family, you would value that one for that reason alone. Or if you happen to live in a different area, oh, your best friend would be from there and your spouse would be from there. That doesn't diminish that you can have those things, like not saying that, oh, you shouldn't have a family or shouldn't value the family or shouldn't, value people in your immediate area. But this absolute notion is what is questionable, right? I call it the false absolute to specify. So how do you rationalize specifying, for example, yourself to one partner, right, within the stimuli acme? How do people rationalize that when there's so many options out there, whatever? How do you justify limiting it to just one person? And the way that you do that is by posing it as a false absolute. You can't use any criteria like, oh, because they're so good looking, or because funny personality. But if then you'd have to meet all other people on the planet and see if they're equal or greater, right, in those same ways, or it'd be an impossible criteria to make, so you just bypass it and you say, oh, it's just an absolute. And why is it absolute? Oh, because it has to be for us to rationalize this restrictive, subversive state where we specify an inherent process to one person and one person only, because it's easier for society to control that. And so you understand that that's the reason why it's done. And so what would be the rational, objective reality behind that is that there would be no basis to specify it. There would be no basis to limit it there. So again, it's not an argument against anything. It's just rather poking a hole in the argument for it. Right? The best argument against something is a flawed argument for it. One of my old logical razors. So basically, you understand in this that, right, no claim or argument is actually being made there. It's more just observing the folly of that. Like this uniform one-size-fits-all thing that you would say, okay, you're going to absolutely specify it to one person. So anytime an absolute like that is posed, it's invalid. There is no actual basis for that. You could not explain it. You would have to appeal to some, again, ego that, oh, but I just love them so much. But, okay, define that, hold it accountable, give us a reason why that couldn't apply to somebody else, right? And so you can't do it. So to kind of gratify your ego and control you through that, you have to say, oh no, it's an absolute, a non-accountable, false absolute, undefined, just it is absolute because it has to be. And so the functional basis could be a way you could argue for it, but this wouldn't be still absolute. Or this is what would take a hit to the ego, right? You would say, it's a functional basis. The reason why you're sacrificing potentially being with anybody, everybody else, and limiting yourself to one person is because you want it, because it's, love, and it's meant to be, and they're your soulmate, right? This is the propaganda that plays to the ego that's able to exploit you and control you. But the reality would be, okay, let's make a functional argument because it's easier for society to control, and because it creates a family system, and, they can be functional and all this. If that was the reason that was stated and acknowledged, people would have a lot harder time with it, because then people don't like to think they're being controlled. They'd rather feel, oh no, it's a soulmate, it's love, it's meant to be, instead of, oh no, it's a subversive state that we're kind of pressured into because it's easier to be controlled that way, and functional family system basis. So that is the interesting difference, right? It's easier to control people through their ego and say, same thing like with God or something. Oh, it's, God's will and it's above and it's meant to be. No, it's some arbitrary subjective person, kings and government and this and that who want to control you. So it's easier to make you feel gratified. Like, oh no, you're not, a person wouldn't commit a crime not because they're afraid of going to jail, even though that's an important underlying dynamic. They would not commit a crime because they're a good person and they get this gratification from it, or it's almost like a euphemism to what the reality is. You try to turn it into something else that, again, appeals to the ego. You can't just state out what it is. You have to pretend it's something else or something more. Right, like, you'll go to heaven, or you'll just something above. So basically, you're okay, let's go back to the thing again. I have like a million different ways to describe this concept, so it's kind of hard for me to pick which the best ones are. Like, so again, getting back to the point, through gratification. So let's look at it through a functional lens, like, hard work, right? This is one of the best ones. So absolutists would view, functionalism as a zero-sum process, right? You're doing something like work or whatever, labor, to achieve a zero-sum end. Like, you're doing it for this goal, for this result, right? So that would speak for itself. So there would be no ego or emphasis on it. You would just try to do it as efficiently as possible, just try to get it over with. Either do as little as possible, so don't require much, like almost be a minimalist, so you don't require to work much because you don't require much from that. Or, so there would be no ego in that. It's like, you don't require much, so you don't do much. Or you see it, again, it's a zero-sum process, so you do it as efficiently, as quickly as possible. And if it's worth doing, then do it all the way. Otherwise, if not, then don't. And so you would do it either for the excess most amount of means that you can get out of it, or, again, you would just do it to get it over with, do it as quickly as possible, do it as efficiently as possible. So in both of those scenarios, there is no ego. It's just a zero-sum process, right? And even there's a reversal where you say, this person makes six figures and this and that, and they're so egotistical because of it. But it doesn't make sense, because think about it. What that could be framed as, that person's greedy then. They require so much. They require so much overcompensation and they're materialistic and greedy. So it's not gratified that, look how hardworking or how smart or capable or accomplished they are. It's actually, look how greedy and materialistic and superficial and how much overcompensation they need. It's not even that that's a negative. It's like, you require more, you desire more, so therefore you do more to get it. So all it would take to remove that need is, you just don't want all that. So don't think of it as, this person is more accomplished and more successful and this and that. Look at it like, you make less, but maybe you don't require as much, you don't want as much, you don't need as much, right? So this is the point, is like, there's nothing impressive either way. You make more money than someone else, but maybe that someone else doesn't want more money. Maybe they don't require it. Maybe they don't desire it. Maybe they wouldn't use it, right? So it's a zero-sum process, so it doesn't matter. Or if it did matter, then it'd be an endless cycle. Like, you can never have enough then, so you're a nobody, right? Unless you're the richest person on the planet, and even then it's a zero-sum process. You still would have more to get. You have to be a trillionaire, right? So there's no way to win that from a credibility standpoint. If it's a measure, like, it's zero-sum, it's endless. You could never have enough then. It would never be an absolute. So either value it fully or don't value it at all. So there would be no ego in hard work in that sense. Like, you're doing a zero-sum process for a zero-sum end, which is your own zero-sum self-interest. So why would that be gratifying? Like, yes, I make six figures for myself, and I work hard for myself, for the money that I spend on myself. So where's the ego in that? It's zero-sum self-interest. Like, so what? Right? Where is the ego? It's a way to control people. Again, you gratify, like, you feel so good about yourself. You're so proud. You're so whatever. But again, you're doing it for yourself, and you're requiring more. So if you just required less, you wouldn't have to work as hard. So then don't complain about it. Or, if it's so stressful, or if it makes you act like a dick, to do something, then don't do it, right? Then maybe it's not worth it. Maybe you don't ultimately want it, or do something else, do something lesser if it's so stressful. But no, it's like, don't require it, don't desire it. Again, it's a zero-sum process that serves your own self-interest, so there's nothing to be proud of, right? There's nothing to be gratified about. But there's a trick with this, like, that you get, oh no, you're hardworking, or oh, you make more money than other people, but it's a zero-sum process. Countless people make more money than you then still, so, it's meaningless. You could just require less, you could just desire less, you could just be happy with less. So it's not an absolute. It assumes the intent of people that, oh, it's a zero-sum process where people always just want more and more and more, and maybe people think they want more, but you only desire or require it because of the state that you're in, the subversive state where everything's overextended, or you're kind of forced to do it, but it's a zero-sum process. So if you have enough to survive, which could be very, very little relatively, then you could be happy with that. So then what's the problem? Right? It's assuming that you would require that or desire that, but there's no ego in that, because again, it's zero-sum self-interest. So if you were to state it directly, like, oh, look at this job I do and look at how hard I work for my own zero-sum self-interest, so why is that something to be proud of? If you don't require as much, then don't work as hard, and that's fine. Or if you do, then it's only because you desire more, require more, so it should speak for itself. It shouldn't be like some imbalance that, oh, it's so stressful, and oh, look at me, I'm doing all this. Well then, again, if you're not happy with it, then don't do it, or do something less. Don't require as much, be a minimalist, do something lesser. Right, so that would be the gratification of functionalism. Like, again, it's a zero-sum process, so it's kind of hard to explain that, why that would be gratifying. And it can be an endless sort of trick and struggle that way too. Like, there are certain things that are glorified, like, oh, you grew up poor and you had a tough upbringing and this and that. It's like, that shouldn't be glorified. Not so much that, oh, you overcame it and you dealt with it. I can respect that, but that's not the point. It's like, ideally, you shouldn't have to deal with that, and we should work towards the point where you don't have to deal with that, instead of glorifying it like, well, that's some special thing, like credibility and positive element, that is because, or, you'll glorify struggle and you'll condemn privilege, like, oh, this person had successful parents and now they have an advantage because of that. But isn't that the point? Isn't that a good thing? Like, what else did the parents work for if not that, in part? Like, yeah, they did work for themselves, but didn't they work for their children too, to give them a better life? And so why is that a bad thing? Right? Why do we condemn privilege? Ideally, everyone should have the privilege of having good parents, right? So it's a trick. It tricks you into condemning success or privilege, like, oh, that's a bad thing that your parents work to be successful and that benefits you. It's a bad thing for you to be successful or wealthy or whatever. It's a bad thing. Positive things are a bad thing, and negative things are a good thing. Like, oh, struggling is a good thing, and being poor is good. Oh, look at us overcoming adversity and this and that. Again, I can respect it in a reactive sense. Like, yes, you might not have had a choice. You had to deal with that. I respect it. But don't get tricked into that by saying, oh, so in other words, struggle is good. And so we'll perpetuate it. We'll say, oh, we're going to be poor too, and we're going to make sure our kids are poor too, so that they can struggle with it too and prove something. And then their kids will be poor too, and they'll prove. No, at some point you break the cycle. Okay, you struggled through it. That was unfortunate. Now, because you struggled through it, your children will have to struggle less, and theirs less and less and less, and eventually they won't have to struggle much or at all. And that's the goal. That's the whole point. Instead of also a stimuli, acme, preserver, vouching state, where you would say, well, don't have kids then. And that's the greatest trick of the government. We'll give you welfare. We'll give you money if you have kids to pay. Like, that's a little bit bold-faced how they're controlling you, right? The incentive almost to have kids, because you'd get a certain amount of money for each one. But basically, you wouldn't have kids if you were poor. Just don't have kids, because if you're going to use that as an excuse or struggle, right, why would you do it then? Right? Do it in a state that you really vouch for and are proud of and can really attest to. And that's not me saying it by force, like, oh, you're not allowed to have kids then, but then don't use it as an excuse, or don't like, oh, look at me, I'm working so hard to put food on the table for the kids. It's like, well, who told you to have them? But it's a situation where, again, that's one major trick, is, again, of glorification, gratification. Struggle is a good thing, so let's perpetuate it and make sure people struggle forever so we can feel proud about overcoming it. Like, again, I can respect if you had to do that. It's unfortunate but necessary. I get it, right? You didn't choose to be in that situation. You're born into it. I get it. But then your parents also were irresponsible, lacking in credibility, preservers of the stimuli acme, who have zero credibility at all for doing that. But even then, and you would not do the same, you would not perpetuate the state. So that shows you the absolutist would never create that same, an absolutist would never make the same mistake twice, basically, or even once, right? Like, they would learn from that and say, okay, my parents are irresponsible preservers of the stimuli acme, so I'm not going to do the same. I'm not going to preserve it unless I vouch for the state. So you would never have that same problem. But no, you would also realize that, again, struggle is good, because, oh, look how egotistical gratified we feel for overcoming it. And, oh, privilege or success is bad, because somehow, oh, look, they didn't have to do this or that. So you create this dynamic of condemning good things. Again, the end result is, their parents worked their whole life for this in part, right, to do that, to give them a successful start or advantage or whatever. That was part of the whole point, right? People don't just work for themselves. If they have kids, they're doing it for their benefit too. So that's the whole point. So this whole idea that you have, again, let's condemn privilege as if we're jealous or bitter, right, that we didn't have it too, and like create this subversive state, instead of, oh no, let's glorify it and say it's a good thing to have that privilege of having good parents, and that's the whole point. That's what they worked for. That's what we should all do. That's what we all should have had. And it's unfortunate, right, if you don't, but that's what we should work towards and strive towards. So don't be tricked into condemning that and saying, oh no, that's a bad thing that you had good parents and a good circumstance, and it's a good thing that you had a bad circumstance. Oh, that makes me better than you. Oh, that gives me credibility. Oh, look at me, I'm gratified, right, for the struggle. It's like, but let's put an end to the cycle instead of acting again like it's a positive and validating thing, right? That's a good example of this problem. But the other side of the ego is the fact that everything that's done is to appeal to the ego, in the sense that that's how you're controlled. Like, it's sort of hard to explain, but I can pose like a 2-character example, right? In fact, this is a play on my series of short stories from a long time ago, like the 2 kings. But this isn't to do with the 2 kings discussing things and arguing and debating different topics. It's to do with the king and his son. So one of the 2 kings and the son, right, like the king and the prince, basically. So the prince is like quiet and doesn't talk, but they're smart and they know a lot of things and they do a lot of things, right? And so it's like a thought experiment, basically. So the prince, again, highly capable, highly smart, but they don't talk much. They don't have any ego, right? They reject the ego. They see it as being kind of superfluous and whatever. So the perception could be like, oh, because they're so neutral in that way, it must be that they have nothing to show off, or they must be, somehow lacking. But it's kind of the opposite, that they're so capable they don't feel the need to do that, or they don't extract any ego from it. Again, seeing it as a zero-sum process, there'd be no need. They want that to speak for itself, and they don't want to get muddied by the ego. So they just want the actions to speak for itself. They don't extract any ego from it. Or again, they could be so above it that they don't need to seek that. They just let actions speak for themselves. And so that person would be more dismissed or condemned in society despite having that ability still. Like, you can put this to the test, right? If you don't talk as much, right, you're more quiet and neutral, and you're not trying to insist upon yourself, you're trying to reject the ego, you won't be respected as much, even if you're more or equally capable, because again, that's where it comes from. You have to appeal to the ego of others, and you have to, insist upon yourself, outwardly insist, and people are reactive and initial minded. Whereas again, the king would be loud and obnoxious and like insist upon themselves, and they're always taking credit, like that Master Chef or Kitchen Nightmares one. Hello, my name's Nino. Right, Nino is the king, and the chefs who are actually cooking and doing all the work are this prince. Like, they're too busy doing the work and actually doing what needs to be done to take credit for it or insist upon the ego, or they consider that trivial. And so, they might seem rude, or they might seem, disinterested or unimpressive, but they're the ones actually doing the work. Whereas, the king is taking all the credit and doing all the talking and sucking up and making deals with the elites and like doing all the stuff that they get credit for on the social level, right? And benefiting from the work of others around them or beneath them. But so, and even if they are capable themselves, it's like, you could be equally capable, but one of them is not taking credit and rejecting the ego and doesn't seek anything from that, and the other one is insisting upon themselves, outwardly insisting, kind of taking credit, pushing their ego, right? So that shows you the dichotomy of what society would value, is that they'll value the loud, taking credit, egotistical, the, social appeal to your ego, like, this other dynamic. So what people value in that sense in society collectively isn't credible. It's not actually based. It might seem to be a pretense, like, right? Like, intelligence is defined by the social element, not by the functional, actual element of a standard. So what happens is, again, the ego comes back to that it might seem that way, right? Like think about a highly capable, accomplished person, but who's, again, doesn't seek the ego, doesn't speak much, doesn't do any of that. They just kind of let everything speak for itself, and they reject the ego basis by which people are controlled. That would be perceived negatively, because people almost want to be controlled by their ego. They want you to appeal to it, appease it, right, which kind of bypasses their logical side, which is sort of exploitative in a way. So you might not want to do that, but they want you to do that because they're so used to it. And then, of course, preconceived notions come into play. But no, basically, that analogy is pretty fitting, because what you have is, again, the one who's, like, let me pose it in a more dramatic way, right? So the king is stupid and senile and sort of just doesn't really know what they're doing, but because they're in that position, people preconceive. They're older, so age, one of the things that, again, is valued in the stimuli acme in absence of actual value, because it's something initial, superficial, that you would just basically right, like something superficial that would be valued just because, without any real meaning, right? You can be old and stupid, or you can be young and smart. Like, it's nothing tied to it, but right, it's something that's just valued just for the sake of it. But it's a situation where again, this ego basis would be that, like, you're somehow, right, if you reject that as a basis, it's like somehow you're lacking by it, but you could just have no need of it, no desire. You, again, want value to speak for itself. You could be above it. You could be, again, absolutist, highly efficient. So you're rejecting that, but people want that. And so now it's like, people want to be controlled by that as you appeal to and appease their ego. And so again, you may see it as exploitative. So again, let's go back to the king. The king is senile and stupid and doesn't know anything and doesn't do anything. But because of their preconceived position, they're given certain credit just because of that alone. Okay, they're the king and people want to suck up to them, or they preconceive something about it because of the stature alone. And the age is given credit, even though that has there's no merit to age. You just happen to be around for a long time. That doesn't mean anything inherently. But so you're given credit for all these things that don't matter, but on an accountable level, you are not actually given any value at all, or you don't have to have any value at all. And so, right, so all the things that actually matter, intelligence, practice, capability, is all lacking. But all the superficial elements, but they're old, so that must be good. Respect your elders. Or, they're already in this position, stature, so we're going to preconceive something. So you value those things. And again, the social element that's sort of self-fulfilling, because based on that positive preconception, now it'll seem better too. Like, everybody's sucking up to them, or more social like that, because that's how they perceive it. Right, so it gives the illusion like, the king is so socially skilled, but it's only because everybody is so nice to them or open with them because they're the king. So it's the stature of self-fulfilling. If they weren't the king, they now they wouldn't seem as socially good, because people wouldn't be as open with them that way, right? So it's sort of self-fulfilling. Again, whereas the prince or this other person, right? People aren't as nice with them because of, again, preconceived notions. And so what happens is, again, that's self-fulfilling. They would treat them differently, and now this is one of those, like, defined by reaction fallacies. Like, you'll treat each side differently and then define them by their reaction to how you're treating them. So you're still the one defining it, but like, you treat somebody positively because of your positive preconceived notions, and then their reaction is more positive, so you give them credit for that. But then you treat someone else negatively because of your negative preconceived notions. Again, they're younger, whatever it might be, appearances, and now they'll react negatively to your negative preconceived notion, but you treat it as a baseline and then define them by it. Like, well, you're the one treating it a certain way. So it's like, you understand that, again, you're imposing that, you're, again, it's sort of self-fulfilling, and there's no actual standard being used. It's like a dependent overextended pretense, like, again, preconceived notions or something perceptibly to gain, right, because of the stature. So again, a lot of it is that self-fulfilling preconceived and reaction, right? You're reacting to how other people treat you, and how other people treat you is based on certain preconceived notions about you. So that's why the initial appearances and stuff like that, stature, age, all these things that are kind of superficial identity type things are supposedly so important, because that's what people will immediately react on, and then everything else is secondary to that. So So again, let me pose that analogy once more. Again, the king who's stupid, doesn't know anything, he's dumb, he's not capable, doesn't do anything, is valued because of their stature alone. And then the prince or someone else who is highly capable, highly efficient, but they don't talk much, they don't seek attention for it, they have some negative preconceived notion, whatever, and then again, they reject the ego, they don't care about that. Right, but in terms of actually a measurable standard, it would be better. Or even if it's the same, it's like one of them is seeking attention and all of this social element, and the other one isn't. So it shows you what you're controlled by. Like, the people who rule you are not necessarily the most capable, but the social element it turns it into a popularity contest. And that's also something an absolutist wouldn't require or desire. They don't want their own ego to be appealed to. This whole basis is rejected. They don't believe that anything they're doing is necessarily gratifying to the ego. It's just a zero-sum process. So they would just let actions and results speak for themselves. So, a deliberate choice, they're not wanting to play into that. But when it comes to, again, this rule by omission society that I've talked about, that's still what you'll have to deal with, is that people want to be exploited by that. People will exploit one another by that. And so then you're the odd one out for simply not doing that. So again, person A, highly capable, efficient, intelligent, whatever, but because they don't socially reduce it to a lowest common denominator or seek any credit for it or do anything that appeals to preconceived notions or an ego basis, right? Again, either they make that deliberate choice, they don't view it as this could be how, again, absolutist view. They reject the ego basis because everything's a zero-sum process. So there's nothing to be proud of with that. Just let it speak for itself, right? Or they even wouldn't consider it that impressive in the first place. Like, they could do more, they could be more efficient. So by their very high standard, even if it was impressive, that wouldn't be the most impressive version or form of it. And then you also have again, so person A versus person B, right? And it shows you sort of the examples that society would glorify and follow, is that true value is negative. If you're truly efficient, that's like rude, or that's somehow negative. If you're truly too, direct or honest, that's somehow rude, like it seems sort of blunt, or it seems sort of I don't know, there's a negative association, right? So it's a subversive state, half-mast state, where true value is a negative because it reveals or exposes the needlessness of a contrivance state in the first place, right? An absolutist will invalidate that. So you want something less efficient. Too efficient is negative and bad. Somehow it's rude. Somehow it's rejected. And again, too direct, too honest is somehow negative as well. They want some overcompensation. They want to be fooled or tricked or kind of used to it. It's kind of like a negative structure where it's a negative structure whereby you're able to have that projection that that's how we're ruled, so we're going to perceive everybody that way, right? Like we assume, like, someone who's unconditional and doesn't want anything and is just neutral and rejects that exploitative egotism would be perceived that way, like, they must be trying. It's actually the opposite, right? Someone who doesn't want anything will somehow be perceived in a negative way, like, they must want something, they're just not good enough at getting it. Right, so like, if you don't, this is like the anti-thought of social contrivance. Like, if you don't say anything, or you're kind of quieter, neutral, non, that'll be taken as inability to achieve that, not that you don't want anything or you're unconditional, right, and neutral. It'll be projected like, oh no, you do still want that same thing that we assume, but you're just not good enough at getting it, right? It's like inability to achieve the false absolute, not that it couldn't be absolute. So again, the neutral is projected as that, and then the incentivized that actually does have that incentive is seen in a positive way, even though it's an overcompensation. Like the only reason why they're doing that, right, why they're more outgoing or placing undue emphasis and this and that, they're only doing it to achieve that end. They have the incentive. So one of them has no incentive but is projected to have it, and they just have the inability to achieve it, not that they just don't have the incentive in the first place. And then the second one is they have the incentive, that's why they place undue emphasis and overcompensate. So it might seem genuine or positive, but it's only done because they have that incentive. So it's interesting because people would be aware of the nature of a process if you're neutral and non and quiet and let it speak for itself. They would assume that, or they would see it then. But they wouldn't see it if you, again, engage in this anti-thought of social contrivance that, you're socially kind of distracting them from the nature of the process, overcompensating for it. So it's the same process. One of them is making you aware of it through neutrality, and the other one is trying to distract you and bypass and overcompensate. So that can be a deliberate choice. Like, you don't want to use that. You want to just let it speak for itself. But people want to be controlled by that, or are so used to it that that's how they perceive everything in the false duality. So again, neutrality or non would be projected as inability to achieve this incentive, not that you don't have the incentive. And again, the overcompensation to achieve that, undue emphasis to achieve that, will be somehow seen as positive, even though it's incentivized. So again, these are many ways that you're controlled by the ego, and so it's a subversive state that isn't based in actual true value, right? And that can be nothing more than ignorance insistence, as I call it. Like, what are you appealing to? You're appealing to something that someone else is familiar with in their own limited experience, and insisting upon that like it's somehow special or important, when really it just is just like anything else, but it's given special undue emphasis because of their experience with it. Once again, going back to the non-base of self. Something is valuable just because you are familiar with it and have experience with it.